Awesome. Thank you, Doug. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. As Doug mentioned, my name is Sabrina Albert. I'm one of the partners at Madrona Ventures, where I primarily invest in AI native companies. And we're very lucky and fortunate to have had the chance to invest in Gradial at the earliest of stages. And it's been awesome to be a part of the journey with them. So today we're excited to talk about what's the state of the possible within AI and how the models are constantly adapting and evolving. And I'm joined by two really great panelists here today. So first is Evan Hanlon, and then also Justin Young. So maybe Evan and Justin, could you give a quick 30-second intro on yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Hanlon. I'm the GenMedia leader for North America for Google Cloud. I lead our go-to-market teams for anything having to do with direct content generation across VO, Lyria, Banana, et cetera. And before my time here, I spent 15 years on the WPP side, where I was responsible for building our data and AI platforms there.
Yeah, and hey, I'm Justin. I'm an engineer on our applied AI team at Anthropic. My day job is basically to work with startups, mostly in cybersecurity, and help them build agents, help them build on our API. My background is in cybersecurity. Before I joined Anthropic about 18 months ago, I was at a cybersecurity startup called Abnormal for about 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Well, we got a lot to cover, so let's dig in. The first thing I'd love to get your perspective on is where we are in the AI world today. So, one of the things that I often observe is that a week in AI can often feel like a year in normal SaaS times, and things are constantly evolving. New models are getting released, new products are getting put into production. So it's hard to keep up. And I think in a room full of marketers that are trying to learn and understand, it'd be awesome to really understand from your seats what is actually possible today and what you guys are seeing. So maybe Justin, we can start with you in understanding. Can you share with us what you're seeing is possible at the frontier model layer today? Anthropic has been releasing a lot of new models. There's a lot that you can actually do with it. Maybe just start by sharing what you're seeing and what's different today than even 6 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Claude Code is a great example here. If you tried Claude Code a little over a year ago when it came out, it honestly barely worked. It could write, maybe a function in your code. It wasn't that useful. What you can do with it now is build entire apps. It can run for 20 minutes and build you an entire app that might have taken you a couple of days to build. It's still not perfect. You need a human in the loop to verify its outputs, steer it, mold the output to what you're actually picturing. But what is driving that is almost entirely new model capabilities. And you couldn't build something like that really even 6 months ago. It's mostly the model driving that change in what it can do.
Awesome. And Evan, maybe on the practical side, what are you seeing in terms of application use cases for marketers, how people are actually starting to kind of think about leveraging the technology itself?
I think that the surfaces in which the models are emerging, both from a consumer and an enterprise perspective, are becoming a lot more intuitive and accessible. And I think that's doing in two things. One, it's allowing experimentation in a way that I think feels a lot more natural to the way that both people and enterprises really want to be able to apply that to things that they've been doing before. And almost counterintuitively, I think it's also exposing where the opportunity to really break with old ways of thinking, old ways of working, and old ways of doing things is really starting to emerge as well. So I think that pervasiveness is actually giving rise to a new way of thinking about it. 2 days ago, we released Omni, right, which is a totally different way of thinking about how to create video content that goes beyond just kind of simple text descriptions and being able to be truly multimodal in some of that creation. And I think that this is some of what people have been thinking about, looking for, searching in the science fiction realm, which is becoming much more of a science fact perspective. And so I think that's a very exciting development that we're seeing in terms of acceleration from the past 6 months.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Justin, you mentioned Claude Code. I'm curious if there's any other things from a model unlock technological perspective that have really shifted in the last, call it 6 months or so with the long reason horizon models. Like, is there some unlock that is really happening that is causing people to actually start leveraging the tools today, be that Code or Claude Code or otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's some nuance here, which is that new models come out and they typically have some incremental jump in capability. This is like a pretty smooth curve of capability increases, but I think sometimes you hit this critical threshold where there becomes this qualitative difference in how you can interact with the model. You would never, go into your terminal and say, build me an app before, but like at some point that threshold got crossed where, that is now possible. And I imagine there are similar parallels in the marketing side of things too.
Super helpful. So before we talk about headwinds, I'd love to talk about some of the wins that we're seeing in the market. And one of the things that I think marketers are constantly thinking about is how do you demonstrate ROI? So once you put something into production, how do you think about it? How do you measure it, especially in the AI context? And so I'm curious from both of your perspectives, how might you guide or think about ROI specifically as you're using these sort of tools? Is there some way to benchmark the value that you're getting from deploying a set of different AI solutions? Maybe we can start with you, Evan.
Yeah, I think that the framework that marketers need to be thinking about ROI when it comes to the deployment and application of AI is, the good news is it's one that is not going to be foreign, right? And really thinking about what's an efficiency play and what's an effectiveness play. On the efficiency side of the world, there's a question of how can you start to deploy AI and think about it from a marketing use case, whether that is creative, whether that is production, media buying, content generation, whatever it is that you're ultimately looking at, and thinking about how can I do more of what I've been doing before, but in a faster or potentially more efficient way. So a really good example is if you're trying to start to experiment and really understand and ideate around the pre-production, side of things, right? Instead of sending folks out to, potentially scout locations or, go through more costly mock-ups, right? How can I start to generate some ideas sort of very, very quickly to kind of get a jump start on that? I think you can start to look at that being able to do more with less, or being able to then reallocate some of what you're budgeting to different parts of the marketing mix. I think on the effectiveness side of the world, I think it's really starting to focus on where can AI be applied to really start breaking some of the bottlenecks that have existed within marketing. I think, the dynamic creative area is a really, really good one, right? Before, if you had 100 different messages that you might want to send to 10 different segments, right? That's 1,000 different pieces of creative. And when you get to, for example, the paid media side of the world, that's a hard thing to scale. It's a hard thing to connect up to frequently to, where you actually want to run, some of that marketing. I think now both being able to scale from 10 to 1,000 for, a relatively, low marginal cost there is a really exciting piece, but also the ability to leverage more agentic workflows to be able to see more of that, not only content, but data and context flow through to those endpoints is a really, really exciting and different opportunity. So I think that, being able to think about the force multiplication effect, both from an efficiency and an effectiveness scale, right? It's I think a mode that most marketers have been thinking about for a really long time, but we've got a new set of ideas, applications, capability to be able to do that, and also to join those things up in ways that we might not have been able to before.
Yeah, I love, Evan, what you said about sort of doing more with less. I would even say it's easy to fall into a trap of thinking that, okay, my job is going to look exactly like it did before. Now I'm just like 20% more efficient, and maybe my output is 20% higher or something. But my experience has been, I'm just doing new kinds of things that I never was before. I'm building a new tool that I never would have had time to do. I'm like doing some kind of analysis that I wouldn't have done before. What's the ROI on that? I'm not really sure. But I think this is just generally like a hard question. Like, what's the ROI in using, Excel or Google Sheets? Like, I think it's positive, but like I can't really put it down in numbers. So
It's
who
better
knows?
than using a calculator, to crunch out a bunch of numbers. So I think that's the positive ROI. But I love that framing and thinking, right? It's enabling you to be, often it's said 10x engineer, but it's like, how do you become a 10x marketer? How do you do the things that, Doug was alluding to, where you can actually do the creative and fun parts of the tasks, and then, use AI to kind of do the boring and more remedial tasks. I think one of the challenges, though, that a lot of people face is how do you actually put these systems into production, right? And so that's a headwind that we're kind of seeing. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you guys are seeing maybe on the model side, Justin, and just even getting Claude Code or Claude Cowork or whatever it is up and running? Are there technical challenges? What are you generally seeing from some of the customers that you're working with?
Yeah, so what I think is fundamentally hard about this new kind of technology that's different from something like Excel is that it's non-deterministic. How do you think about how to use a tool that is like really powerful, but 10% of the time it totally messes up? What that probably means is that you need a human in the loop, but how do you, are you verifying every single output? Are you becoming like a statistician and doing some kind of sampling? And like, it's just like kind of a hard problem. So I work with a lot of startups. That's why I'm very bullish on, folks like Gradial and other startups that I work with, because they are solving that hard problem. They don't make you turn into a statistician and like deal with all this statistical uncertainty in what the model is doing for you. But that's like clearly a headwind for, if you want to build your own agent. I think building agents is fundamentally pretty hard for that reason.
Yeah, I think what Justin's sort of hitting on is a really important piece of it, which is that orchestration is going to continue to be a really important role, in fact, probably the most important role that marketing continues to play. And again, this is not something that is new. What we're orchestrating and how we're orchestrating those things are ultimately different. And I think the thing that, in particular that's exciting about Gradial and where the focus is there is, yes, the models matter, right? The technical capability matters in terms of what they do, but the services, the workflow, the interaction between those pieces are just as important as well. And I think we're going to go through a pretty major examination across the industry about what is really necessary across these different systems, and how and where do those systems ultimately live, right? What is SaaS? What is an agent? What does exist inside of platforms that already exist? What are things that you're going to work with the Anthropics and the Googles of the world to build and develop, but that live with you in the future? And how do those pieces communicate, right? Because there's not going to be, I think, one monolithic end-to-end system across the data layer, the model layer, and the surface layer. So I think that all of those things are really exciting also because I think it's going to move faster. I think it's going to be more economical. I think it's going to be much more dynamic than when it was large enterprise software, plays that, took months, if not years, to implement, right? We're in that zone where we're going to be able to experiment, see what works, see what doesn't, move a lot faster, which I think is also going to spur on more of the innovation that we need because, we're not going to be able to sit still in terms of how those models and how those services are actually working.
What about a behavioral change in terms of, I think, Justin, maybe you were just alluding to this earlier, but kind of this idea that you have to trust the model to do certain things. Maybe before you're very used to doing things in a certain set of ways, and you don't even really know how to think about how do I psychologically change and ask the model to do these sort of things. Is there some sort of recommendation that you have for the audience to just start jumping in, or how do you get that mind shift to really switch and to think about what's actually possible?
Yeah, I think one key is to shift some of your focus from solving the problem to verifying the solution. And I sincerely apologize. I know this is not a room of software engineers, but I'll use that as my that's my background. Hopefully the metaphor comes through. But there's a shift of looking at the code to just looking at the unit tests. If the unit tests pass, you know that everything is working. But that is sort of your scaffolding for knowing that everything works. So Evan, maybe you can give a more legible example for marketing of what verification looks like.
Yeah, well, I think the shift that you're describing is a really, really good one. I think historically on the marketing side of the world, a lot of the focus has been around, kind of planning, prediction, right, and trying to focus on getting it right and then seeing whether or not it worked sort of down the line. And frequently we've penalized ourselves or teams or others, right, for things that don't work. And I think a negative signal or seeing that something that doesn't work is just as valuable as seeing something that does, because we have the ability to adapt and move quickly in a way that we couldn't before. So I think moving to that mode of, experimentation and focusing on shipping and getting things out there to see and get the feedback that we need to around that is going to be far more important right now. And I think that, what we've seen with a lot of marketers is that I think there's sort of two schools of thought right now. There's one which is that, well, we've got what we believe is sort of 100%, right? And there is a hesitance and a reluctance to deploy or use AI until it can hit that 100%, right? Which is a real limiter, right? Because we should be thinking about what are the new possibilities and abilities to do, right? It's got to hit 100% of my brand guidelines. It's got to be 100% of, my golden principles around marketing before I sort of roll it out. And I think that we are being given this moment an opportunity to examine, to say, okay, well, in a world of a new set of tools and a new set of laws around here, do those principles still hold? Do those guidelines still matter, right? Is this something that is going to, have a real negative impact with my consumers and customers, or is the good of what's possible going to far outweigh that? And so, I do not believe that there is a world in which AI replaces human creativity, right? I think that creativity and creation are frequently conflated in a way that isn't useful. I also think that that's the wrong. I don't think that that's the thing
Yeah.
when you're on the ground working with teams who are really putting it to work. Like they're not having that debate. Like they're recognizing what is possible in terms of just being able to move very quickly. So I think that that's how I sort of would think about it, which I think very much tracks with some of the mentality that actually does migrate over from the software engineering world to where marketeers are focused.
Yeah, I love that. It's just enabling you to be more creative, to unlock that side of creativity, and then again have the AI do certain tasks that you might just not want to do.
Absolutely.
And so as we think about the next 12 months, obviously a lot is changing. The world is moving fast. Maybe you can share a little bit of insight without spilling the beans. I think people are really curious to understand what might actually be possible that in the next 12 months. I know people have heard a little bit about Mythos, Justin, so I don't know if there's something there that you can share broadly, but I'm curious to hear your guys' perspective on that.
Yeah, I can start. I think there's two sides here. Like Mythos, I think, is a good example of there are moments where, like I said, a threshold can be crossed and there's an emergent capability that is totally new and wasn't happening before. But at the same time, I think that for the most part, this is a continuum and we're just going to see smooth progress. I guess an analogy I would give is self-driving cars. People were talking, 10, 15 years ago about, hey, we have this demo, the self-driving car nails it on the test track. Are we going to have self-driving cars all across America tomorrow? That the answer is no. Like, what has to happen is the efficacy, the success rate needs to go from 90% to 99% to 99.9% before you're going to fully trust it. So I think it's just going to, be a smooth climb up that success rate continuum.
How about for marketing specifically, Evan? Anything that you think will change in the next 12 months?
I think that there's two places I would keep an eye on. I think on the model side of the world, and this is going to be kind of a boring answer, which is that the capability gains are just going to increase, right? And so you see where, particularly on the generative media side of the world, where we were a year ago to where we are now in terms of multimodality, right? In terms of audio being able to show up with video and being able to synchronize audio with video, et cetera, right? All of those things which needs to get these models to more of a production grade, right? There's just more and more of that's going to be coming online. And in some ways it's going to feel, I think, kind of small ball in some places because it's going to be really focused on feature increase. But that's the difference between, I think the broad ability to generate an image and to generate an image that you feel like is going to be close enough to pixel perfection to put to work for you from a marketing perspective. So I think that, to your point, crossing the threshold, reaching escape velocity, if the models I think are kind of there right now in terms of generation, but getting to those fine-tuning pieces to really put in the hands of artists and marketers, I think that's just, you're just going to see more and more of that, and you're going to see the pace pick up on that. I think that's exciting. I think that's mostly a positive story. I think on the flip side, I think there's going to be a major shakeout and disruption to, I think, very classical and legacy systems, right, that we were using for marketing. And I think, we even saw that in a bit of the opening and how Gradial's perspective is I think, really kind of already there. But, I think the world of a lot of these, again, very large, monolithic, expensive, slow-moving, slow development lifecycle systems, you're going to see a major level of disruption to them. And I think also a lot of folks who were kind of biding some time by kind of just dropping an MCP server in front of this stuff and, calling that Agentic and hoping to get there, are either going to be forced to evolve or they're going to find their position within the workflow starting to be threatened. Because I think what is also going to start to happen is, I think particularly as more and more of you all in the audience as well as your teams get hands-on with what is possible and really start seeing it from an experimental point of view, you're going to start being the ones who push the systems. You're going to be the ones who start to, I think, question what that ultimately looks like. And I think that's super exciting for the teams, but it's really destabilizing for, I think, the broader ecosystem. But I think it's destabilizing in a good way. I think it also opens up the opportunity for people too, because what I have seen as well is that, you get these tools into people's hands and all of a sudden they're doing things that historically we wouldn't expect or necessarily assign to them, right? You have media buyers who are experimenting on the creative side. You have creatives who are starting to think about test design for, marketing campaigns. What you actually see is that the people who are leaning in and using this stuff the most are actually multimodal in their thinking as well across the marketing stack, and that you'll actually be able to get a lot more out of your teams as those silos start to fall around that as well. So I think that's exciting, but also a little scary.
Yeah, I love that. Everyone has that aha moment, right, where they're like, oh my gosh, this can actually do so much more than I thought it could and can make make me so much better at my job. As people are actually then now pushing and using these agents in production, using these new models, one of the things that I think people are thinking through is like, who bears the risk, right? Is it the model provider? Is it the agents themselves? Is it the human that pushes it out into production? How should people think about that so they're not discouraged to actually use the different systems and agents and models, et cetera? Maybe start with Justin.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty strong view on this. The human is the one who bears the responsibility. This is a tool that you use. You're ultimately controlling the tool. You're responsible for its outputs. That's why verification is important. I think I just leave it at that. Yeah.
But how does Anthropic maybe think about governance and risk and responsibility? Is there ways that you're helping the user to make sure that they're kind of guiding and doing the right thing so they're not afraid to use the model to the full capability? I guess, is there some things that you guys set in place?
Yeah, and it depends about what risks we're talking about. If we're talking about cyber attacks, biological harms, things like that, Anthropic obviously has very strong safeguards against that. If it's more like, okay, my marketing campaign is bad, it went out into the world, I think it is a better model that can prevent that knows what good looks like. But ultimately, still, I think everyone in this room is in control of the work that they're putting out, and that's the world that I expect us to continue living in.
Any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think to Justin's point, it's a human decision at what point of automation and deployment is being made. So the question is, where does that sort of risk and responsibility fall? And at the same time, we need to make sure that we are incredibly responsive to how people are using these models and using these tools and providing the correct safeguards and getting feedback, because if at the end of the day it's generating a bad experience on that's a real thing. And also being very conscious and cognizant of how these models are ultimately interacting with enterprise data, with enterprise intellectual property, et cetera. So, there are real responsibilities that we know that we have to sort of rely on, and that is a dialogue that ultimately exists. And at the end of the day, it is humans on both sides, right, that are making those decisions. So I don't think that that's ever going to be something that we can fully sort of outsource. It's just sort of where is that falling within the sort of decision-making process.
Awesome. I am going to open it up for questions. So if anybody does have any, please be thinking about them now here in a minute. But one other question that I do have for you guys is it's this idea that a lot of the AI conversation gets framed around maybe cost cutting, right? You can use AI to save costs. You don't have to spend as much. People are more productive. But how about the flip case of just revenue generation? And especially in the marketing context, right? How can you use AI to actually kind of pull different levers to create kind of this upside over time? Anything that you guys are seeing or any creative ideas that you've come across?
I find that the conversation around cost cutting is typically isolated to folks who are the least exposed to what it's actually being used for, and also where AI, the application of AI is a continuation of what we've been doing before, right? If you look at advances in machine learning across marketing, for the past 10 years, this has been a subset of it, right? We've just hit an inflection point in terms of how it's being deployed and the scale of it as well. So, I do think that there is, once you start to getting to the practical pieces of it, I do think that there are conversations around how do you keep it zero sum, right? How do you make sure that it is not necessarily, in the short term, proving out some of these experiments without sort of writing enormous check. Like, that is a real thing for sure. But I think, it is not in consonant with most of the conversations you have around getting to an ROI to prove out the investment and to prove why you want to reallocate resources in sort of different places. So I think it's a useful talking point, but it's one that is also frequently, I think, obfuscating the real, sort of things that are happening inside of organizations.
Awesome. Any questions from the audience for our panelists? No takers? Oh, please. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I can.
Thank you. I would welcome both your guys' perspectives on this, but I think maybe this is more for Evan. So you guys spoke about, like the beauty of experimentation, and I think like as our organizations are starting to adopt these tools, there are some people that like really go and kind of like just see what they can do and really get out there and try it out. I think there's some people that like don't do it as quickly. Like, how do you recommend we think about like, is there a beauty in kind of leaving that beginning of the adoption like intentionally playful and experimentation is like really the forefront, goal? And then at what point do we start to think about like putting, like a process around like what we've learned from that experimentation? Like, is there a strategic timeline that you can kind of think of when we think about, adopting these new tools in general?
Yeah, I think that the allowing for a more open-ended playfulness, to your point, I really like that term, and zone of ungoverned experimentation is a really critical first area, because I think early on, in particular, there's a lot of questions. Okay, like what do I actually do with this, right? And how do I actually use this? And so you'll see the curve, I think, be relatively low, and then at some point it'll explode. And just to give you an example, my previous tenure at WPP, when we rolled out our Agent Hub, the first 6 months, you saw very little activity, and then the next 6 months, 5,000 agents were created out of a power user base of about 10% of the population, right? Like, just insane, right? And that's really great, because I think people were given that zone and ability to sort of look at it. I think what's really useful there too, and also why I think having a real enterprise approach to how that's actually working, though the infrastructure around it, is really important too, though, is because you, as I think, leaders need to be able to start to understand, okay, where's it getting used in a useful way? Where's it getting used in a not useful way? How do you put some governance around that, and then codification around reworking your sort of ways of working there? So I think that observability and, of that experimentation, which then leads to a more kind of structured way of thinking, okay, we're going to refocus here, we're going to put these things here. By the way, maybe the team formations are going to look a little bit more different, right? We're going to pair up people from these different departments who maybe didn't work together before. Like, I think that comes out of that experimentation and that playfulness initially, but I do think you kind of got to get it into people's hands. Also, because I don't think that it's like, you must use this to do this, and generate Y. That doesn't work, right? Like, it feels very coercive, and actually will lead to worse outcomes, I think, than allowing for one where it's a little bit more of a playground approach.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
I'll add on to that a little bit, because you talked about roles starting to blend quite a bit, and I would say we've seen some of that within our own organization of using AI to generate different ideas and pass it along. And is there a point in time when there's a governance around that as well, not to box people in, but also make sure ideation and tool use isn't going above and beyond where it probably should before getting to production or decision making from a business perspective?
I think so. I think that, again, like, I think a lot about this in terms of, historically, right, you might have encoded, right, certain principles, ways of working, right, ROI models in a certain place, and that was sort of owned by one person and extended down, right, and everybody sort of followed suit from that. I think now we're in a zone and an area where the ability to run those experiments, to validate those, to test some of those things, right, are showing up in more places, in more spaces, and I think allowing for that is really important. That said, you need to be able to scale that. You need to be able to get to some consistency. You need some apples to apples comparisons across a lot of those different activities. So I think, you don't want 5,000 campaigns having 5,000 different flavors that are not quantifiable or comparable. But I do think how and where people are ultimately doing that is ultimately going to change. And just to give you an example, I think that, some of the most interesting developments around, new applications for, planning, creation, production, in marketing are coming from departments that are not necessarily from there, right? Again, so you're seeing like a media buyer come up with a really phenomenal analytical framework that you can action around, creative performance prediction. That's not their job, but like they obviously, it actually is, because they're dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. And I think allowing for more of that versatility, but also then, making sure you've got the governance in place so it doesn't go completely out of whack, I think is really important. And it helps you, I think, start to, again, challenge some, maybe like previously long-held beliefs and reimagine some of those golden principles down the line.
Awesome. I think, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. But Evan and Justin may be around for a little bit in case anybody does want to grab them on the way out. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today. This was a really fun conversation. I think we could talk for a lot longer. Up next, I'm excited to welcome up Travis Kelly, who's a partner at Proven Capital and leads investments across the B2B applied AI space as well. He's going to lead the next fireside chat. And thank you guys again.
Thank you.